Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. You're joining us, well, not live because it's a podcast, but today is Friday, January 15th. We're very excited to be here with you. It's a much different tone than it was last week when we recorded our show. Scott, how do you feel today, given it's been a week and a half since the siege on the U.S. Capitol?
I am apprehensive. That's probably my probably the best word. You know, I think it has been easy. It's easy on social media and in person sometimes to kind of, look at some of the stories and see some of the things that we saw happen at the Capitol last week and think like, what the hell? Like this is, and almost find some of it comical in its absurdity. But you also see that the more information we come out about what happened on January the 6th, the more reporting there is about what was actually taking place in the Capitol, the more it becomes clear how serious a breach of security this was, how clear and present a danger it presented to members of Congress, to members of the executive, including the vice president, and how close we were to seeing, as bad as it is to have 5 people killed, how close we were to seeing something a lot worse than that. And, there's a lot of talk about needing to tone down rhetoric. I am apprehensive that we're going to see more political violence before we see less. So I guess my mood is somber. Andy.
That's fair. I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I agree. Obviously, we don't have to talk about this a whole lot because I'm sure many of our listeners have, like us, been reading and watching the essentially wall-to-wall coverage of this over the past week and a half. I will note 2 things that are worth noting. One is, folks, just avoid any state or federal office building for the next few days if you can, right? And I have friends in other states that work in federal buildings that have been asked or told to not come into work. That's the case here as well, even to the extent that the head of the Oklahoma Second Amendment Association encouraged their members to not show up to the Capitol. And stuff is bad when the people that normally want you out there with your guns are telling you to stay home. And so that's a big shift, I think, in the rhetoric already. And because of that, if those guys are saying to stay home, I am nervous about the folks who are choosing to go out anyway. Secondly, the other thing that I will say of note before I kick it over to Bailey.
Well, and Andy, go ahead.
As I since the last episode is that the president has been impeached again. So that's a major development, I guess, in our national political field. We don't talk a lot about national politics on the show, but it's worth noting for posterity that in the past week we've had that happen for the first time in history that the president has been impeached twice. I believe of all the impeachments in history, President Trump has half. Right? It's only happened like 4 times, and he's got 2. So there's that. Bailey, I'm sorry.
True.
Hello, welcome to the show. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things that connect what we're talking about to Oklahoma. One thing that we're seeing is some suppressed anger that people are feeling. One of the things that happened as well, in addition to impeachment, you saw the response from many businesses and particularly technology platforms who have chosen to permanently block the president from using certain platforms. And they've been cracking down on the people who believe in the Q conspiracy. And so people were going to applications like Parler to share their far-right viewpoints and frustrations, and they were using that to organize. And now that mechanism has basically been taken from them because Apple and Google and every tech company said we're not going to support this platform. And so there's a lot of people who don't have a place to share their frustrations or organize in the way they did before. And so I think that further elevates your warning, Andy, that like things can be dangerous. Because sometimes if people can get an outlet, write it out, be done with it, they can say it out loud, but now there's no outlet for people who have this frustration that they've been gypped by the government, that the government's trying to take their rights, that they're trying to silence the person that they showed up for the Capitol for, right? And so that's something to be cautious of. And then it ties to Oklahoma because we have a very significant portion of our population who believes in the conspiracy theories and supports President Trump. And so even among our legislature, there were nearly 40 members who signed on to a letter saying that different states needed their elections reviewed and overturning results and things like that. And so with the second impeachment, and then Democrats having control of all branches, especially the Senate, so there's a likelihood that the impeachment trials will move forth quickly. You're going to of what's happening at the federal level, but from the lens of like a backlash. So I wonder even how much business is going to get done this session, because there's going to be so much talking about the Democrats in DC, talking about standing up for Trump, standing up for our country. And so what is this going to look like going into 2021, even looking at state and local politics?
That's an interesting thought. I don't know that we will see the Senate take up the impeachment trial right away, if at all, because the Democrats don't have the votes to convict President Trump. So McConnell said he's not going to do it before Trump leaves office. And then afterwards, they're coming in having to deal with an impeachment trial, a vaccine response that's, as we saw today, there is no back office storage of vaccine. So that's a big issue. And then the COVID relief itself. And those are enormous. All three are huge tasks that require a lot of political glad handing and a lot of backroom deals and just a lot of work to get through. And so they can't possibly do them all three at the same time, aside from all the other, transition and governing stuff. And so I wouldn't be surprised myself if the impeachment trial gets delayed or even held off, because at least for the next week, there's a few things that are outstanding, right? Will President Trump attempt to pardon himself? Is that constitutional or not? If he does, and if he doesn't, will there be criminal cases that are coming out against him from all these investigations that might hit afterwards? I can see the Democratic majority in the Senate saying, you know what, we're not even going to mess with it. We'll hold it over their heads, but we'll let some other court take it up first and see if they can deal with that while we deal with getting this COVID relief pushed through. Those are my two.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Andy. I think there's a real possibility. There is a real possibility that they actually don't have a trial in the Senate. I mean, that could be totally wrong, but I think that's possible. I do think, though, it hinges. I think whether they have a trial and what happens in the trial hinges almost entirely on one man, one guy, one dude, senator from the state of Kentucky, Mitch McConnell. There's a story in the New York Times yesterday, the day before, that says Senator McConnell, who's currently Senate Majority Leader until January 20th, says that he is glad that Trump has been impeached. This is, of course, all on background anonymous sources. He says he's glad that Trump has been impeached because it will make it easier to purge him from the Republican Party. And I think that's kind of that's kind of a trial balloon. He wants to see what the response to that is. If Leader McConnell and other people of similar stature in the Republican Party think that the best thing electorally for Republicans in the future is to try and rid the party of Trumpism, and they think that impeachment and conviction in the Senate is a way to do that, then I think it happens. Right now, assuming that every Democrat and soon-to-be Vice President Harris voted to impeach, that's 51 votes, which means you need 16 Republicans to join you. Assuming that Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Pat Toomey, Mitt Romney all voted yes, in agreement with Democrats, that's 4. So now you need, 14 more? I think if you don't have Mitch McConnell, it's really hard to come up with 14. But if Mitch McConnell decides he's going to vote to convict Trump, which according to follow-up reporting in the Times today, he says he hasn't made his mind up on, I think if Mitch McConnell votes to convict the president, I think you get to 14 a lot easier. I have no idea. I have no idea if that will happen. But I think I wouldn't be shocked either way. I wouldn't be shocked if there is no trial and just he's impeached and that's the end of it. I also would not be shocked if there's a trial and he's convicted because some of the higher ups in the National Republican Party decided that that's what's best for the party moving forward.
Yeah. Interesting. Well,
all that to say,
take. So I think 2 things hinge upon whether there'll be a trial. It depends on what's happening among public pressure and public opinion over the next couple weeks. I think there's strong momentum among the Democratic base and even Republicans who are frustrated at what happened at our nation's capital. There could be enough pressure to make Democrats prioritize an impeachment trial. And it could be an opportunity for Democrats to put Republicans in the hot seat, right? Because the advantage would be in their court to say, look, we're going to immediately have a trial because what has happened under this past administration is unacceptable, and we want immediate justice for, the lives lost at the Capitol and the destruction at the Capitol and all of that. And then it puts Republicans on the spot to decide whether or not they're going to stand for democracy or not. I think another element would be what type of politicking would be happening around this time as well, because it also gives Democrats an upper hand for negotiations, because maybe they may say we won't pursue impeachment trial if you will support XYZ in whatever package they're trying to do next in coronavirus relief, or because there's even conversations that Democrats want to take up raising the minimum wage, right? And so it'll be interesting to see what becomes a priority within the next 100 days.
I totally agree.
Of COVID relief plus where the energy is for impeachment trial.
And I wonder too, Bailey, to your point that Dems can put the Republicans in an uncomfortable position of having to take, what could be a very difficult vote for some of them, whether they vote for or against convicting the president. There's a lot of talk right now about unity and coming together. Currently, there are not 60 votes in the Senate to do a lot of the things that Dems want to do, like raising the minimum wage. I have no idea. I don't know enough about the inner workings of Senate politics to know if this is feasible or not. But I wonder if the impeachment and the question of whether or not to have a trial for the president gives the Dems any leverage over some of their more moderate Republican counterparts to say, hey, maybe we don't have an impeachment trial, but maybe you vote with us to raise the minimum wage, right? Maybe you help us with some of our priorities. I have, we could, and many people do, have entire podcast series that are about nothing but these issues. But we do have a session here that will resume on February the 1st. So should we transition to what's happening there, or we can keep talking about stuff happening in DC? Because I'm good either way.
We have to have a spin-off podcast just about national stuff at some point.
Let's move on.
So today we're going to talk about a general overview of the Oklahoma State legislative session, how it happens, the process and procedures for any of our listeners who may be new to the process or have forgotten, right? We've been doing this for 5 years, so we've got a few things figured out. Although it seems to be, new and exciting every year. And we're going to talk about our predictions for what we think might happen. And before we get there, though, I do want to talk about one other current event, perhaps the most notable thing in state politics that happened this week in Oklahoma, and that's that Governor Stitt rolled out a big plan and had a press conference and called for all students, K through 12, to return to in-person instruction. Now, this call was based on, he cited some data from a study in North Carolina that study indicated that out of, I think, 32,000 students that were going to school in person, or I don't know how many thousand, but there was only like 32 cases of COVID transmission and none between students and adults that they noted from their contact tracing. Now, swiftly on response to this, right? Like it was an American Academy of Pediatrics study, but the state chapter of the AAP, as well as OEA and State Superintendent Joey Hoffmeister and a bunch of other folks,
and the author of the study in question.
That's right. Oh, you stole my thunder, but that's exactly right. Yeah. So these people all came out and said, "Oh, hang on, homie. That study only works if you have all of these other community transmission things in place, such as universal masking across the whole state and a bunch of other stuff."
And guess what he won't do?
Right. Which we won't do. We do not have, and we won't do it. Yeah. And so everyone's like, yeah, okay. But then when I saw that the author of the study was like, "No, this is wrong. I have been misquoted. This is applying my stuff incorrectly." I was like, that, in order for the study's author to even get wind of this and then take the time to respond, I felt like it was a big deal. And so that has continued to roll out. I even as we speak on Twitter, people are talking about it. Scott, of course, I wanted to go to you as a physician and pediatrician, and I think we know how you stand on mask mandates and probably on the governor's response, but specifically about this, what stood out to you most?
So, it's interesting, and I did not participate in, but I lurked on a Facebook conversation between several doctors about this earlier this week, and it's interesting because there is some compelling data about. One, we know, I think everybody knows, people that are, no matter what side of this particular issue you're on, that the best place for kids to learn ideally is in school, or at the very least that parents should have the ability for their kids to go to school. That's what would be ideal for the kids, for the parents, for everybody concerned, right? So there's no question there. But the question is, how do you do that in a way that's safe for the kids and that's safe for the parents? And the study, as you mentioned, it does show that there's much less transmission in schools than you would think, provided that community transmission is much lower than it appears to be in Oklahoma. So comparing the study in North Carolina to what's happening in Oklahoma is not only like apples and oranges, it's like apples and, like dogs or something, right? I don't know, like you're looking at kind of two different things. The third thing I would say is that while it is true that you don't see the rate of transmission in kids and as severe disease in kids as you do in adults, most of the time we are seeing an increase in severe disease in children, particularly not from the COVID itself, but from this post-COVID condition called MISC, which is an inflammatory condition that causes a systemic organ failure, multi-system organ failure, shock, can put kids in the ICU, can put kids on ventilators. It has cardiac implications. It's really a very severe condition, and we are seeing a ton of that in Oklahoma right now. I mean, a ton is relative. We're seeing a significant increase of MISC in children as a post-COVID syndrome now compared to where we were a few months ago. So again, my takeaway is that, like, one, it's not you. Anytime you look at a study like this, one of the first things that you learn when you're learning critical appraisal in medical school and in residency is you take the piece of literature in question and you ask, does this apply to like my patients or my practice or the setting that I'm in, right? If I treat only people that are 65 and older and the study's done in people that are 10 to 12, that's not going to be translatable. And so this is a classic case of taking a study that was done under very specific conditions and putting it in conditions that are not similar at all and saying, see, we can do this here. So that's, I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, Scott. And I think, when that study was released and even when the governor cited it, everyone was like, well, okay, this is potentially good news, but that's exactly right that we do not have anywhere near the control on community spread in Oklahoma that would be necessary for this plan to work. And to me, the thing that stands out the most and is that of many is that they didn't even consult with the Department of Education, right? Joy Hoffmeister was not.
Yeah, I was about to say not even just the Department of Education, but like the elected state superintendent,
right,
who oversees education and calls the shots on things. And so it's like the governor doesn't have the magic wand to say, schools, you're going to do X, Y, Z. And so at the end of the day, I mean, it's really ironic that like there's one hand of like local control that conservatives preach, but then there's this moment where it's like, well, we want you to do this thing. And so then local control says, as far as like our elected school boards and like superintendents of individual school districts and our state superintendent then get to say, thanks for the information, but no.
Yeah. Well, and there's a Twitter account that's like a spoof account called Oklahoma Gov just Googled. It's Gov Stitt Googled. And they tweet often. I don't know who runs it, but often it's pretty funny. And just a few minutes ago, they tweeted how to make opening schools a political issue. Which is funny because that, his office has put out some statements that's like, well, we're sad that, they've made this into a political issue. And I'm like, okay, first of all, it's the governor who I don't think he's overstepping his authority in this by trying to mandate schools do something by going around another official that was elected in the same election, who many people have rumored may run against him in the next gubernatorial election. And I was like, it just seems it's bad form, and I feel like it's politically unwise.
Agreed.
Yeah, I agree.
But I'll add that, like, even around this time last year, we were talking about how the governor picks political fights among different branches and state agencies. And so this is just another example, because it was fights with the legislature, on budgetary things, and then it's fights with the tribes, and then it's fights with, this agency. And now I guess the fight has turned to public education from selections of who he's appointing to the state boards that oversee, certain things like charter schools and other things. And now it's this battle directly with schools, trying to, strong arm them into opening their doors. And so this is just really interesting of how he's picking these political fights as governor.
Well, I think he wants to appoint the Secretary of Education or the state superintendent, right? Like, if it's up to him, he would be able to appoint all the agency heads and all the department heads.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. If it was up to him, he wouldn't have to deal with pesky things like courts and state legislators and, law. Like he's a business guy. He's a CEO. And he's used to being able to say, no, I want to do it this way. And that's the way we do it because this is my company. And that's what I decided. Right. And he seems to still be frustrated by the fact that that's not the way that government works. He wants to be able to say, no, I'm ordering it today. I am deciding we are opening schools. Right. And he's frustrated that he can't do that. So, I think he is probably working behind the scenes to try and get the State Board of Education to mandate to individual school districts that they have to offer in-person instruction. It seems pretty clear that's what he's kind of working on in the so-called the back channels. Whether that'll happen or not, I don't know.
Well, public education is such an interesting issue in Oklahoma because it's often not a Republican Democrat issue. It's a rural urban issue because every rural district loves its school and they want to do everything to protect that school and they trust their superintendents in their community. So there's just a lot of power among local schools. And so it'll be interesting to see, how this shakes out, because even when it comes to go in person versus going virtual versus hybrid, you're seeing breakdowns like rural urban for the most part. And so it'll be interesting to see where even like the legislature will stand on the issues of whether schools need to go back full time or whether schools should have the autonomy to make the decision.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think the urban rural line is also at play in this. I think it may be the governor angling to help solidify his rural support because Oklahoma City public schools and Tulsa public schools both are still doing virtual and by and large, and I think he's pissed that they won't do what he wants. Because Superintendent McDaniel from Oklahoma City Public Schools had a statement the other day in opposition to the governor's call for the in-person instruction as well. And everything sucks. And I think in response to our lack of control over this virus, people at all levels, individually in our own lives, and the governor for the state and for his political future are trying to control whatever they possibly can. And it doesn't always work out.
Speaking of the governor trying to control everything that he possibly can, we've talked at some length about his executive order decision, whatever you want to call it, to move the public health lab from Oklahoma City to Tulsa. Well, at the time that was announced, to Stillwater, excuse me. Several in the legislature were not pleased with that. And as of this week, Representative Ryan Martinez, a Republican of Edmond, has filed legislation to say, nope, we're not gonna do that anymore. So Representative Martinez has legislation that would specify that no state asset is to be moved further than 10 miles from wherever it was located on July 1st, 2020, without the approval of the Oklahoma State Legislature.
Okay, so it would apply to the public health lab. I wasn't sure if it was just henceforth, all things moving forward, or if it was backdated to apply to that.
Yeah.
So how much money have we already spent on this deal? And he's spending CARES money on that.
I mean, yeah, who knows? And then, of course, the question is this going to pass with a veto-proof majority? Because otherwise the governor can just be like, no, I don't like this rule, and veto the bill, right?
I'm sure it will. Because you're going to have bipartisan support for this, right? The Democrats aren't going to want it to happen, and the Republicans aren't either. That's why they got Ryan Martinez to run it.
I also don't know. I don't know from the article I saw if it's going to have an emergency in place, because if it does, it won't take effect until November 1st of next year, right?
Of this year,
if it does not have an emergency in place.
Right, yeah. That's a good point. So it would be down to the governor trying to rush to get it built in some kind of pole barn or something up there, I guess.
Which is strange, because if the goal is to stop the governor from spending money in this way, why not put an emergency to make it immediate?
Yeah, surely they will.
Yeah, I mean, one would think, but it doesn't say in the press release that I saw whether there's going to be an emergency there or not. So that's, we've talked about what we think is going to happen in session this year. That's clearly one thing that's going to happen in session this year. What else have you guys seen any other bills?
So just a couple of bills, but before we talk about bills, let's talk about process for any of our listeners who are new. And if you are, hello and welcome. This is Let's Pod This. My name is Andy. Scott and Bailey are here as well. Let's talk about how sausage gets made. So the state legislative session starts February 1st. It's always the first Monday of February.
And this is a new legislature. So any bills that were filed last year are dead, and they had to start over in this process.
That's right. We go with a 2-year legislature right between elections. So this is the first regular session of the 58th Oklahoma legislature. It will begin at noon on the 1st, and it kicks off with a joint session, which I don't know how they're going to do it, but normally everyone's in the House chamber. I don't know if they're going to do the same because of COVID this year, but they do that. Oh, they are. They're going to have the Senate up in the gallery, I think. And so they gavel in, and they do the first reading of all the bills, which basically means all the bills are now into the chambers. And then the governor comes over and delivers his State of the State address. And so we'll do something. We'll either do a live blog or something. That's what we've done in the past. Usually we're there and we live tweet it. Maybe we'll do that too. But with our success from our live blog on election night, maybe we can do that. It's usually pretty interesting to hear the governor's priorities, what he wants to see happen this year. And then immediately following, the legislature throws it out and they do whatever they want, right? Like, is that how it happens pretty much?
Yes, I think that is pretty much what happens. Is that the governor says, here are the things that I think are important. Here's what I would like us to focus on. The legislature says, oh, thank you, Governor. Clap, clap, clap. We have our own plans and designs. See you in May.
Right. But it's like, so it's a mini version of the State of the Union address where this is just the governor talking about the state, his plans. He gives a status update to the legislature and to the people. And then he lays out his agenda for the year, and then he leaves, and everyone discusses it for the rest of the day. When it comes to lawmaking and the legislative process, a few terms that I'll identify real quick, and Bailey, you can chime in as needed along the way. Every bill has to be read 3 times. The first reading happens on day 1. That means all the bills that have been filed have been first read, and that allows them to be eligible to be assigned to a committee. They don't actually read the bills aloud. There will be thousands of them, likely somewhere around 3,200 to 3,500 bills, maybe as many as 4,000 since last year was a short session. So we'll see what happens. But all of it will be first read, and then the bills will be assigned to committees. It doesn't all happen on day 1. It'll happen over a period of days, but the committee meetings will start, I think, on day 1 for the most part, and they will start hearing some of these bills as bills move through committee. Then they can move to the floor, and then they will hear them there, and then once they're heard on the floor, that's third reading, right? And then they can be voted on, approved or not. And then
it goes to the opposite chamber.
Goes to the opposite chamber, right? And then the same process starts over. So they go to committee over there.
So then the whole process starts over. They go through the whole rigmarole again.
That's right.
Well, and I tell people that it's almost like watching your favorite elimination game show, like watching like American Idol, where, you start with all the people in all these communities trying to be the next American Idol. But then, months later, you only see, a few dozen people actually make it to Hollywood, right? because
Right.
there's all these levels of consideration. And so I think legislative process is just like that. So yes, next week, by next Friday, because that's the bill deadline for members to be able to put text in their bills, you're going to see like over 3,500 bills. But it doesn't mean that all 3,500 are going to advance through this process. Some of them are going to get, eliminated or at least put on hold to be considered maybe next year. and even then, they probably won't be considered next year, but they'll just be put on hold to move up through the process. I think only like 6% of bills last session actually made it into law or got to at least to the governor's desk. And that was only because we were in a weird time with coronavirus. So even things that they probably wanted to work on, they probably had to put towards the back burner to quickly get members, out of the building and adjourn. And so from what we hear, leadership is saying, like members like President Pro Tem Treat, that they're going to prioritize legislation to say, does this thing really need to be heard this year? Or why does this bill need to be heard this year? So we may even see fewer bills move through the process.
I mean, they say that, Bailey, and I hope that that's true, but I feel like every year they say that they're going to do that. They're going to prioritize those bills, and every year, like the first 10 bills out of the gate are guns, abortion, and maybe something else with guns and abortion. Like it seems like the first priority every year is always some bill that is some kind of like social wedge issue that is really important to the majority, and they do that in the first 3 weeks, and then they start something else. Maybe it'll be different this year. I know they've said that they're going to make open meetings a priority for the first couple weeks of session. Exemptions to the Open Meetings Act allowing state boards and committees to meet virtually, I think is hugely important. I'm curious to see what else is a priority coming out of the gate.
Yeah, I think that'll be interesting, and that legitimately needs to be done. It's a shame that they waited this long. They could have done a quick special session on that. But I think given the everything else going on, that probably wouldn't have been that quick. So I'm optimistic they get that done. While we've been recording, I happened to see on Twitter that Senator Rob Standridge from Norman has filed a bill that addresses what he calls censorship on social media. Now, of course, this is stemming from as Bailey mentioned earlier, the president being kicked off of Twitter and Facebook. Standridge compared these actions to the thought purge in Nazi Germany, which is a absolutely terrible and insensitive comparison. And basically, it would say if Twitter or any other social media account or a company deletes your posts, that they would be civilly liable for up to $75,000 per intentional deletion or censoring.
Isn't it wild that like free market and private businesses exist until moments like this?
That's exactly right. I will say it again, as I'm sure our listeners know, the First Amendment does not apply to private businesses, right? It does not mean that you cannot face consequences for shooting your mouth off. The First Amendment protects you from the government silencing you, right? And in this case, it's almost the reverse. So I, as listeners know, I'm also the director of the Freedom of Information Oklahoma, which is a First Amendment and Open Records Act, Open Meeting Act organization. We don't yet have a statement, but I expect we will, because this is ridiculous. Like, first of all, when you sign up for Twitter or Facebook or whatever, you agree to the terms and conditions. You likely choose not to read it, which is at your own peril, but you agree to their rules, one of which is they don't have to let you post hateful stuff, right? And this happens all the time. So I expect that bill won't even be heard, but it's good fodder for our Friday afternoon on news cycle, I guess.
Well, it's also a good reminder too to our listeners that just because something advances in committee doesn't mean that it's going to make it all the way to the governor's desk. Sometimes there's political strategies that happen to where members of leadership will allow something to make it through a subcommittee and make it to a committee, but will block it on the, or it may pass all the way to the House floor just to allow that member or the Senate floor to make a statement to say, look what we did, and then they won't let it go from there, right? And so you never know, it's a hit or miss. So hopefully it's one of those bills that won't get traction. But if it does, I don't foresee it being one of the ones that go to Governor Stitt's desk and get signed into law, because every experienced lawmaker knows that that just sets up the state of Oklahoma for a good lawsuit.
Yeah, same thing with that local control bill, right? That Senator Dom filed, that basically said the bill seeks to prevent cities or municipalities from having mask mandates, but it has to go through Health and Human Services Committee, which is chaired by friend of the pod, Senator Greg McCordney, who used to be mayor of Ada and is a staunch proponent of local control. And he has all but said that bill's not even getting heard in my committee. So,
yeah.
And it's the same people every year, right? It's always Senator Dom, Standridge, these guys that file these ridiculous bills.
He said at some point, Senator McCorney said at some point every session, local control is one of the hills I end up dying on. It's like that's never gonna happen.
Yeah. Well, so Scott and Bailey, aside from bills we've seen that have been filed, what's your gut tell you? Like, what are the things you're going to be watching out for? What do you think is going to happen this year?
I'm going to be interested to see if the legislature does anything to change or to try and change the way Oklahoma, how we conduct our elections, if there's anything that they try to change in terms of how we register voters, if there's anything that they try to change in terms of how our electoral votes are distributed, if they try to change it so that Oklahoma's electoral college votes are distributed based on congressional district rather than the winner of the popular vote in the state. I haven't heard any inklings of that. I don't know anything. I haven't heard anybody's running any of those kind of bills, but you're seeing a lot of these pop up in legislatures across the country, trying to modify the way states award their electoral votes. There's a bill in Wisconsin, and I think maybe another one in Michigan, that would change the way that those states award their electoral votes. Currently, there's 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, who have electoral votes that are awarded based on congressional district. And I'm curious to see if any other states, specifically ours, follows that, right? Because that would be, I don't think that they would, because right now, I mean, the Republicans are a lock to win Oklahoma at the presidential level, and the Republican nominee will get all of Oklahoma's electoral votes. I don't know. Do you see what I'm saying? Like that's something I'm just curious to see if any of those kind of discussions pop up.
I think I agree with you on that. I'll be watching that too. I mean, for me, I'm going to be watching, aside from the budget, I'm going to be watching for some bills that have already been proposed and others that I expect that will be essentially an attack on or an attempt to restrict the initiative petition process. And to me, this is an attempt to restrict direct democracy. This is the legislature trying to say, hey, we don't want the people to pass their own laws. We want everything to come through us. And so, which is funny because, they clamp down on the governor for trying to do things because they want everything to flow through them. They also want all of this. And as listeners have heard me say before, and I will say again, the framers of our state constitution specifically included this as the first right granted to Oklahomans, the right to petition their government, because they knew then, just as we know now, that we can't always count on our politicians to do the right or the best thing, because either they don't want to, or the unique politics of that building prevent them from doing it for one reason or another. And this is how we get stuff done, right? While they're caught up in politicking, the people sometimes are like, listen, we need insurance, we need medical marijuana, we need criminal justice reform. These are all measures that happen out here. And so we'll see what happens with that. That's going to be pretty high on my list for things to watch out for. Bailey, what about you?
I will be interested to see. Sorry, my garage is going up, y'all. So my birthday was yesterday, and
Happy birthday.
Thank you. So I have some things going on. Anyways, so I will be interested to see what happens with Medicaid expansion. We know that the voters passed Medicaid expansion. Oh, it feels like forever ago now. But last year, and the legislature proposed a mechanism to fund Medicaid expansion, but that didn't pass. And so now the legislature, in addition to funding needs for the state, because we have faced a difficult time economically with the hit of the pandemic, they'll also have to balance how we're going to pay for Medicaid expansion, especially with the rise in the number of people who now need services. So it'll be interesting to see where they pull that money from, because there's even conversations of using Medicaid as a way to pay for Medicaid. And so
yeah, and Bailey, I think one thing that's going to be crucial there is what happens at the national level. Vice President Biden has unveiled his the part one of his Economic Recovery Act that includes substantial aid to state and local governments to help fill in their budgets. And there's talk that there'll be more of that in the future, assuming it can run the gauntlet of the Congress. And so I'm curious to see what happens there. And I'm curious to see if local elected leaders here, state legislators, state representatives, state senators, even if they're in the majority party, I'm curious if they lobby our federal delegation at all to vote for some of the Biden's administration's stimulus plans, because that will make their job easier, right? Like if the feds write Oklahoma a big check to help cover lost revenue from the COVID pandemic, that makes the job of the state legislature way easier in terms of funding things like Medicaid expansion or COVID. We're trying to get schools open. If they have to provide additional monies to schools for COVID precaution or sanitation or et cetera. So that's one thing that's an interplay of the state and local that I'm interested in.
Yeah. So as we kind of wind down the episode here, I think it's important to know, listeners, if you are interested in tracking legislation yourself, there's a few ways you can do it. One is on the state legislature's website. They have a product called Lens. It's like a legislative tracking system. I haven't really used it that much, but I just signed up for it this morning, and I'm going to be making a video about it here early next week. And so hopefully by the time we next record, I'll have it out there on our YouTube channel, and I will certainly share it on our Twitter and our email list. So be sure you follow and sign up for that. And then also in years past, we have used Legiscan, there's a free version of that as well to track legislation. It's pretty helpful. eCapital has a legislation tracking system that is a subscription-based thing. I hear it's great. I can't afford it. But those are all great ways. Also, if you are interested about any specific bill and you want to know, how can I find, what are the important budget bills or the important criminal justice bills or the, what bills are going to affect the rights of women. My guidance has always been to contact the organizations that work in that area most, right? So if it's like bills that affect women, my go-to call would be to Liz Charles at the Oklahoma Women's Coalition, right? If it's stuff to deal with children, then the Oklahoma Institute for Child Advocacy. Tax and budget stuff, OK Policy, right? Like there's a bunch of organizations out there that track this stuff. Education, OEA, or any of the other bajillion education groups out there. And if you're not sure who to ask, then ask us, and we'll try to point you in the right direction.
I think it's important to remind our listeners that there's an election coming up in the next few weeks for our Board of Education primary. And so today, like in the next 50 minutes, if you haven't registered to vote yet for that election, you need to get registered. But it's not too late to sign up for absentee ballot if you don't have that yet for the school board races. And so I know OKCPS will be, there are 3 people running for chair of the Oklahoma City Public Schools Board. And then there'll be several other school districts that will be having school board races. And that will be February 9th.
That's right. Also in February will be city council elections for Oklahoma City, Tulsa, and a whole bunch of other cities. I think like statewide, it's a municipal election. So again, just because November's passed doesn't mean that elections stop here in Oklahoma. We have elections nearly every month. You can go to the election board website, elections.ok.gov, and sign up for election reminders. They will email you and text you if you have an election coming up. You can also register. You have to sign up again. It's a new year for your absentee ballots. I got mine in the mail for that school board runoff that Bailey just mentioned. So you can still vote safely by mail if you would like, or you can use it just as a reminder to go vote in person. That option is out there. So yeah, we are right back in it. I'm excited about these school board and city council elections. I think that, that local government, right? All politics is local, and this kind of stuff can have huge impacts on how things are going. In fact, my sister lives in Bethany, and she texted me yesterday that she is volunteering for someone running for mayor of Bethany. She has, I will say she's been inspired by me. I don't know that that's true, but she is going to be stepping into an actual campaign role and helping coordinate volunteers and get out the vote for the city of Bethany, which is, I think, super exciting. So good for her and good for you if you're someone that likes to be involved like that. Please do. All right, folks. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for being here. Happy January. Enjoy watching the inauguration next week. It's on next Wednesday. Please feel free to tune that in. I'm sure it'll be streaming on literally every station and channel out there. And we will be back next week with a rundown of all the bills that have been filed this session that we think are interesting, notable, or outrageous. It's always a good time. Have a great week.